Welcome back to News Talk and our look back at a wild week in presidential politics. Our guests, former Hill staffer Dan Scandling, now with Ogilvy, Washington, and University of Mary Washington political science professor and author Stephen Farnsworth. Donald Trump was in Washington this week. He gave a speech on foreign policy that was described in advance as a major speech. It was delivered, it was traditional in the sense that it was words on a page. It wasn't ad-libbed and the traditional Trump remarks. He used teleprompter. It was put together presumably by staff, or a combination of Trump and staff, because the wording of it was very different from anything we've heard from him for quite a long, probably since this whole process began. A lot for folks to chew on, Dan, in terms of the substance of it, his view of America's role in the world, militarily and otherwise. Also, just the tone of it was remarkable because we're used to a certain thing from Donald Trump. It's helped to fuel his success. This was quite different in a purely superficial sense.
He's trying to make the pivot. I'm not sure it's completely working because I'm not sure he wants it to work yet. I mean, you saw the fights already between Paul Manafort and Corey Lewandowski. Is there change? Is there not change? But back to the speech, there was a lot of criticism that there was a lot of, well, he said this, but does he mean that? Or wait a minute, he's contradicting himself within the speech. So I still think he's got a long way to go, and I'm not sure that the quote-unquote establishment thinks some of his policies make a lot of sense.
Does Hillary Clinton see a more robust role for the U.S. on the world stage than Donald Trump? I mean, if these are the candidates we end up with, and we're in a pivot moment now to the general, with these two candidates slugging it, duking it out from now till Election Day in November, is her worldview, her sense of what the U.S. should be in the world, mediating disputes and being involved in different places, fighting the war on terror in a robust way, is she going to have a more muscular foreign policy and he less interventionist?
Well, I think that's quite clear. I think that Donald Trump is relatively close to an isolationist, particularly unusual in modern American politics. When you think about the Republican and the Democratic candidates over the last several cycles, both parties have really engaged in a pretty robust international vision for the United States. And that's really unusual to see someone who's risen to the top focusing more on domestic politics and almost very little to say about international politics. And if this election pivots to a foreign policy conversation, and remember, most elections are won and lost on domestic matters, if it pivots in that way, it strikes me that Donald Trump still has a lot of learning to do. I sort of felt when I heard the Donald Trump speech, when I was listening to it, sort of like a student who's trying to fill a blue book. They have an exam that's an hour long, and they have to figure out an hour's worth of material to put in it.
How do I get to page 16?
How do they get through the blue book? And so I felt sort of like this was somebody who wasn't really prepared for an exam. My apologies to my current students, but that's sort of what it felt like as you listened to Donald Trump talk about foreign policy.
And am I misremembering some of his earlier comments about how we would deal with ISIL and how we would deal with all these other threats and issues that are out there on the world stage? I remember a much more punch-in-the-face kind of approach envisioned by Trump for America.
It's like I said, it's contradictory within the speech, even with nuclear weapons, either with use of force or how much force you're going to use. I think he's still trying to decide what makes sense and what doesn't. But I think there also comes a role now where the media needs to really start pinning him down on, okay, you say, like in Los Angeles tonight, you say you're going to do this, you're going to build this wall, you're going to have Mexico pay for it. How's that going to happen? Because you've got a lot of people out in the middle of the country who believe this. And what's going to happen if he gets elected? How are you going to deliver on this?
I want to talk about gender politics, which cropped up this week. Donald Trump saying that Hillary Clinton has been and is playing the woman card, and if she was a guy, she'd be down at 5%. This comment, I think, Stephen, rubbed a lot of women the wrong way because their view is, I've had to work twice as hard to achieve in the work world and generally because women are undervalued and discounted. So it's not 100% clear to me that he helps himself with this sort of rhetoric.
Yeah, one of the strange things about the Donald Trump campaign is this consistent expansion of the gender gap is as good a way to put it as any. There's normally a gender gap of about 10 percentage points in a presidential election that favor the Democrats over the Republicans. Women are more likely to vote Democratic. What you're going to see in this Donald Trump campaign, if he's the nominee, is a record large gender gap. And if you were getting effective professional advice, one of the first things they would say is lay off insults about women. Do not talk about gender all the time, because every time Trump talks about gender, he steps in it. He insults Carly Fiorina. He insults the hosts on Fox News, of all places, when he's trying to get Republican votes. He then goes down the road of talking about criminalizing abortion for the women who are getting the procedure. You look at the rhetoric of Donald Trump and women, and you have to say, if you're a professional political expert, stop. Just stop. This is going down the road of Todd Aiken and all of the really destructive things that Republicans say that make a gender gap that's a problem a much bigger problem. And I do not understand why Trump doubles down every chance he gets on the gender issue.
With potential impact, Dan, in the general, not just for Trump himself, but for the down ballot candidates, some of whom have to be saying or working overtime with their people to figure out, how do I navigate waters that are starting to look pretty darn choppy?
Well, that'll depend on where you are and what kind of district you have. If you have a 65% Republican district, you can probably weather the storm. If you're in a 55 or below, you're going to start getting a little bit more concerned about, ooh, what's happening at the top of the ticket, and every time Donald Trump says something, am I going to have to be defending it? Stephen, I think if I'm Donald Trump, look how well I'm doing. I can continue to say these things. I can see him telling his staff that. What do you mean I can't say this?
Right.
Look what I'm doing.
Look where I am.
And I'm getting an interview with Megyn Kelly. So why do I have to be quiet? That's his mentality. But I don't think he understands that that's going to change come November.
This is what I'm talking about. We're talking about a need to pivot to a general election strategy, to a general election candidate. And Donald Trump and his insults of the other Republican candidates, of the speaking to the anger in the country, that's all been very effective. But what I'm saying, Dan, is that's not going to get him very far in a general election. And that gender gap is poison.
And we're up on the clock, in fact, beyond. But I think one of the things we're going to be all watching going forward is how much can anyone escape the things they've said a month, 3 months, 6 months ago? Can you just pretend it didn't happen and say, today it's a new day, now I'm saying X? Or do these things, are these barnacles that attach and remain till Election Day? I mean, I think that's going to be one of the fascinating themes to watch going forward. Stephen Farnsworth, Dan Scandling, thank you both for coming in as we wrap up a wild week in presidential politics for you on this Friday. We'll be talking with both of you again very soon, I am sure. An update on the day's top stories and the weekend forecast coming your way next. And then the Caps take Game 1 from the Pittsburgh Penguins.